as chesty. Crowd booed black grandmother at open mic. Their phones dropped when she played the first note. She walked to the microphone in the room, laughed, not quietly, not politely. The kind of laughter that fills a room from wall to wall and bounces off the ceiling and lands on you like a hand, pressed down on the back of your neck. The kind of laughter that is meant to be heard. That is meant to hurt. A woman in the third row cupped her hands around her mouth and called out, loud enough for the whole bar to hear. Somebody's grandma got lost on the way to church. More laughter. Louder now. She was 71 years old. She was wearing a yellow blouse. She had ironed that morning before sunrise, and she was carrying a violin case that was older than most of the people in that room. She set it down on the small wooden stool at center stage. She did not look out at the crowd. She did not say a word. Nobody in that building knew her name. Nobody in that building knew that 34 years earlier she had stood on a stage in Vienna and played the Brahms violin concerto to a standing ovation that lasted 11 minutes. Nobody knew that her recordings still lived in the permanent archive of the Library of Congress. Nobody knew that her students had gone on to sit in the first chairs of 7 major American orchestras. Nobody knew any of that, and in 40 seconds, none of them would be laughing. Subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Now rewind. Rewind 14 months, because that room, that laughter, that yellow blouse, that silence that came after, none of it makes sense until you understand the life that was carried into it. Her name was Etta Mae Holloway, and she was born in a shotgun house in Meridian, Mississippi, in the winter of 1952. The fourth of 6 children, a father who laid brick for the county, and a mother who cleaned houses on the north side of town 5 days a week and sang hymns on the bus ride home. There was no music in the house that cost money. There was no piano, no lessons, no teacher who came on Tuesdays. There was a church 3 blocks over where the choir sang on Sunday mornings, Saturdays, and Wednesday nights, and there was a radio on the kitchen counter that her mother kept tuned to whatever station came in clear, and there was a woman in the congregation named Sister Viola who played the organ, and who one Sunday, when Etta Mae was 6 years old, leaned down after the final hymn and said quiet ahakly into the small girl's ear, "You hear the notes before I play them, don't you?" It was not a question. It was the first time in her life that anyone had looked at her and seen something invisible. She started playing violin at age 7 on an instrument that belonged to the church, a 1930s student model with a crack along the shoulder that had been repaired with wood glue and hope. She practiced in the back room of the church because there was no room for practicing at home, and she practiced before school and after school, and on Saturday mornings while her brothers played outside, and she practiced without complaint because she did not think of it as practicing. She thought of it as breathing. By the time she was 12, the music director at the church had quietly written a letter to the music department at the University of Southern Mississippi because he had run out of things to teach her, and he knew it. And he knew enough to know that what he was witnessing was not ordinary, and he felt an obligation to the child that he did not have the words to explain to anyone, including himself. The letter went unanswered. It was 1964. He wrote again and again. 4 letters over 2 years. The fourth letter found its way to a professor named Harold Swan, who had spent 20 years teaching violin at the university and who drove down to Meridian on a Saturday in the spring of 1966 to hear a 13-year-old girl play in the back room of a small church, and who sat in a folding chair and listened for 45 minutes without moving, and who drove home and told his wife that evening that he had heard something he could not explain to anyone who had not been in that room. Harold Swan spent the next 3 years fighting his own institution to get Etta Mae Holloway a scholarship. He lost the first 2 times. He won the 3rd time. She enrolled at 16. She was the only black student in the music department. She ate lunch alone for 2 semesters. She practiced 4 hours a day, because Professor Swan told her that talent was the starting price of admission, and preparation was the ticket inside, and she believed him, because she had always believed that work was the most honest thing a person could offer. She graduated at 20 with distinction. She won the Young Artists International auditions at 23, one of the most competitive classical music auditions in the world. She toured Europe at 25, Vienna at 26, where the Brahms brought 11 minutes of applause and a review in a German newspaper that called her playing a visitation. She recorded 4 albums. She taught at 2 conservatories. She raised 2 daughters, mostly alone, after her husband died of a heart attack at 44. She gave back to the church that gave her the cracked violin, funding their music program every year for the last 2 decades from her own savings. And then, 14 months ago, her younger daughter, Renee, had moved to Harlan, a mid-sized city in the middle of the country, to take a job as a hospital administrator. And Etta Mae, who had retired from formal teaching 2 years prior, had followed. She did not want to be far from her grandchildren. She was 70 years old. She had earned the right to simply be close to people she loved. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment on a quiet street near the park. She kept her violin in its case on the dresser in the bedroom. She walked every morning. She baked on Sundays. She went to the local church where the choir was decent but not exceptional, and she sat in the 3rd pew and sang along softly and did not tell anyone who she was or what she had done, because that was not how she had ever thought about herself. She was not hiding. She simply understood that the work was the thing, not the recognition of the work, not the applause at the end of the work. The work itself. She had understood that since she was 7 years old in a back room in Meridian, and 70 years of living had not changed it. On the dresser beside the violin case, there was a folded program from the Vienna concert. She had kept it for 46 years. The cover had browned at the edges, and 2 of the folds had split, so she had reinforced them with a thin strip of clear tape pressed along the crease. She had not looked at it in years. She did not need to. She knew what it said. She simply did not want to lose it. The rusty rail was a bar on the south end of downtown Harlan that had been operating under various names and owners since 1979, and that had, for the past 6 years under its current management, hosted an open mic on the first Friday of every month. The format was loose. The audience was regulars. Local acts, mostly. A rotating cast of singer-songwriters, comedians who were still working on their tight 5, a barbershop quartet that had been performing the same 4 songs in the same order. since 2019, a spoken-word poet who went by the name Riverside, who was genuinely talented and knew it. The crowd was not cruel by nature. They were young, mostly, mid-20s to mid-30s. They came for the beer and the noise and the familiar faces and the low-stakes pleasure of watching people try things in public. They had a language for the acts they liked, a specific holler that started at the bar and spread to the tables. And they had a language for the acts they didn't, which was mostly silence and the sound of people turning back to their conversations. The manager was a man named Derek Poole, 38 years old, who had taken over the bar from his uncle, and who ran the open mic with a whiteboard, sign-up sheet, and a policy of first come, first served, and a genuine belief that the space should belong to anyone who wanted to step into it. Etta Mae had found out about the open mic from a flyer on the community board at the grocery store. She had stood in front of that flyer for a long moment, reading it, and then she had taken out her phone and taken a picture of it. And then she had stood in the cereal aisle for another moment, alone, with the picture on her phone and her violin case waiting at home on the dresser, and she had made a decision that she could not entirely explain. Her granddaughter, Nia, was 11 years old. She had started violin lessons 8 months ago at the Community Arts Center, and she was struggling. And last month, at dinner, she had said, in the frank and unguarded way that children say true things, that she did not think she was good enough at it to keep going. Etta Mae had not said much at the time. She had passed the rolls and changed the subject gently, and she had thought about it for 8 months without saying so. She signed up for the open mic on a Tuesday morning. First spot on the list. She did not tell Renee. She did not tell anyone. On the first Friday of November, she ironed the yellow blouse before sunrise, placed the Vienna program in her purse beside her wallet, and drove herself to the rusty rail. The parking lot smelled like cold air and spilled beer. The sound from inside was the sound of a room that was already comfortable with itself. Laughter, the scrape of chairs, the first act finishing up a set of acoustic covers to polite, distracted applause. Derek Poole met her at the door with the whiteboard clipboard, and a look on his face that was not unkind, but was unmistakably surprised. He looked at the name on the list and back at her. She said, "I am first on the list." He's, "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Welcome." She found a chair near the back and set the violin case at her feet and waited. She did not look at her phone. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to the acts that came before her. A young man with a guitar who sang a song he had clearly written that week. A woman who did 3 minutes of comedy that landed unevenly beside the spoken-word poet who earned the holler from the bar and deserved it. Then the host called her name. She picked up the violin case. She walked to the stage. The laughter started before she reached the microphone. It started at the bar and spread. It was not vicious in the way that truly vicious things are. It was the lazy contempt of people who had already decided what they were looking at. An old woman, a violin, a church outfit, a wrong room. The woman in the third row said it. Somebody's grandma got lost on the way to church. Laughter, big and rolling and wall to wall. Etta Mae set the violin case on the stool. She unlatched it. She lifted the violin out and tucked it beneath her chin with a movement so practiced and so natural that it looked like breathing. She rosined the bow with 2 slow strokes. She looked out at the room for the first time, and then she played the first note. Stop there. Stop at that note and understand what it was. It was a single open A. One note, drawn from the string slowly, the bow moving with a weight and a control that comes from 10,000 hours and then 10,000 more, a tone so full and so round and so present that it did not sound like it came from a violin. It sounded like it came from the room itself, like the room had been waiting to produce it. The laughter stopped, not gradually, not slowly. It stopped the way a light switches off. The woman in the third row lowered her hands from her mouth. At the bar, a man in a flannel shirt set down his glass. He would say later that he did not remember deciding to set it down. He would say it simply felt wrong to be holding anything. She played Paganini, Caprice number 24. One of the most technically demanding pieces in the solo violin repertoire. A work that has broken the confidence of conservatory students for 2 centuries, a piece that demands a command of the instrument that most trained violinists spend a lifetime approaching without fully reaching. She played it from memory, eyes open, standing still. There were 43 people in the Rusty Rail that night. In the first 30 seconds, 27 of them took out their phones. Not to scroll, not to check messages, to record. A young woman named Cassie Okafor, 24 years old, a graphic designer from across town who had come in for a drink after work and stayed for the open mic on a whim, pressed record on her phone and held it up with both hands and did not lower it for the entire 7 minutes and 12 seconds of the performance. She would later say that she was afraid to stop recording. That she was afraid she would wake up. An older man near the back wall. Nobody at the Rusty Rail knew him. He was in town for a work conference and had wandered in, off the street, put his head down on the bar with his face in his hands sometime around minute 4. The bartender would later say she thought he was sick. He was not sick. He was crying. At minute 5, Riverside, the spoken-word poet, who was sitting at a table near the stage, and who had performed at open mics across 3 states and had seen every kind of act and believed himself to be essentially unstuntable, put both of his hands flat on the table and leaned forward and stared at her the way you stare at something that is recalibrating what you thought was possible. She reached the final variation. The bow moved faster, and then slower, and then faster again, pulling from the string a sound that climbed and turned and landed somewhere that is very difficult to describe in words, somewhere past technical accomplishment, somewhere in the territory of what music is for. She drew the final note to its end and lowered the bow. The room was silent for 1 full second, and then the Rusty Rail came apart. The holler from the bar, the one reserved for the acts they loved, lasted, and someone started stamping their feet, and the sound built on itself. And Etta Mae Holloway stood at the microphone with the violin tucked under her arm, and she looked out at the room, and she allowed herself one small and private smile. The kind of smile that is not for anyone else. The kind of smile that is between a person and something they have been carrying for a very long time. Derek Poole came to the edge of the stage with his hands pressed together and his eyes wide, and he said, into the nearest microphone, still audible under the noise, "Who are you? Because I have never heard anything like that in my life." she said, simply and without drama. "I Etta Mae Holloway." He had never heard the name. He would look it up that night when he got home, and he would sit at his kitchen table with his laptop, open reading for 2 hours. And in the morning he would call his mother, who had played piano for 40 years, and read her the Brahms Vienna Review over the phone. And his mother would be quiet for a moment, and then say, "Son, that woman played in your bar last night." And he would say, "I know." Cassie Okafor's video went up that same night at 11:47. She captioned it simply, "Walked into a bar and my life changed." She tagged the Rusty Rail and a few music pages she followed. By 2 in the morning, it had 400 views. By 6 in the morning, it had 40,000. By Friday afternoon, it had 3 million, and a classical music journalist named David Prentice at a national publication had tracked down the video, verified the performance, confirmed et identity through the Young Concert Artist Archive, and published a piece with a headline that stopped people mid-scroll for the next 48 hours. The piece laid out her biography in full. The scholarship that took 4 letters and 3 years to win. The Vienna concert. The 4 recordings. The 2 conservatories. The daughters and the grandchildren. And the apartment in Harlan. And the community board flyer at grocery store. And the reason she had gone, which Prentice had gotten directly from Etta Mae herself in a brief phone call that she had taken while sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, unhurried, speaking in the same even voice she always used, as if she had expected the call and had decided beforehand how she felt about it. She told Prentice, "My granddaughter told me she was thinking of quitting. I wanted her to see something before she made that decision." Prentice published that line last, at the end of the piece, and that traveled further than any other sentence in the story. That weekend, a music critic named Patricia Sorrell, who had reviewed Etta Mae's Vienna performance in 1979, who had written the word visitation in her review, and had always been proud of it, called the publication and asked for Etta Mae's contact information. She was 81 years old and still writing. She wrote a second piece, not a review but a remembrance, about what it had meant in 1979 to sit in that concert hall and hear what she heard, and about what it meant now to know that all of it had been quietly living in an apartment in Harlan, ironing a yellow blouse before sunrise, waiting to show a grandchild something true. Then came the cascade. The Young Concert Artists Organization issued a formal statement acknowledging Etta Mae as one of the most decorated alumni in their history and announcing a Lifetime Achievement recognition to be presented at their annual gala in New York. The citation noted her recordings, her decades of teaching, and the particular grace of her continuing relationship with music in private, without audience, without credential, without any need for the world to be watching. The University of Southern Mississippi, reading the piece about Harold Swan's 4 letters and 3 years of fighting, convened an emergency review of their archival admissions records and issued a public letter of acknowledgement. It was not sufficient, and some people said so loudly, but it was on the record. The Library of Congress confirmed, in a statement released the following week, that Etta Mae Holloway's recordings were among the protected permanent holdings in the American Folklife Center archive, that her playing had been considered session nationally significant for 30 years, while the world had largely forgotten to tell her. Three major classical music organizations reached out to Renee with requests for Etta May to perform. She declined the first two, politely and without explanation. She accepted the third, a benefit concert for the arts education program of a school district in rural Mississippi, 40 miles from Meridian, where she had grown up. The ticket proceeds went entirely to instrument acquisition for students who otherwise would not have access. She performed the Brahms, the same Brahms she had played in Vienna. She had not performed it publicly in 19 years. The executive director of the school district's arts program, a woman named Dr. Loretta James, arranged for 11 local students to sit in the front 3 rows. They were between the ages of 9 and 14. 2 of them played violin. One of them was 12 years old and had been considering quitting for the same reasons that 11-year-olds always consider quitting, because it is hard, because progress is invisible for long stretches, because the gap between what you hear in your head and what comes out of the instrument feels sometimes like a distance you will never close. He did not quit. After the concert, Dr. James said he went home and practiced for 2 hours without being asked, and his mother called the school the next morning to say she didn't know what had happened, but she was grateful for it. The Harlan Community Arts Center, where Etta May's granddaughter Nia had been taking lessons, established the Holloway Initiative, a scholarship fund covering full-year instrument lessons for any student whose family could not afford the fees. The initial fund raised $47,000 in 11 days from donations made by people who had watched Cassie Okafor's video and felt something they needed to do something about. Cassie Okafor herself donated the first $500. She had received a job offer from a music media company in another city, who had found her through the video. She took the job. She started the following month. The rusty rail put a small brass plate on the stool that sat at center stage. Derek Poole had it engraved himself. It reads, "This is where Etta May Holloway stood on November the 1st. She reminded us what a room can hold." Nia Holloway turned 12 the following spring. Her grandmother drove to the birthday dinner with a wrapped package that was the shape of a rectangle and about the right size for a book. Nia opened it at the table in front of her mother and her uncle and her 2 cousins. It was the Vienna program, the browned cover, the reinforced folds with the thin strip of clear tape along the creases. 46 years old, carried from a concert hall in Austria to a shotgun house in Meridian to conservatories and recording studios and a retirement apartment with a yellow blouse hanging in the closet. Inside the cover, Etta May had written in her steady, unhurried hand, "The distance between what you hear and what comes out is the work. It closes. I promise you it closes." Nia looked at the program for a long time. Then she looked up at her grandmother. She said, "Grandma, the crowd booed you." Etta May considered this. Then she said, "Yes, they did." And then I played the first note. She said it. The way you say a thing that has been true for a long time. The way you say a thing that you have not needed to say out loud until now, because you have known it so long it lives in you like breathing. And that was that. Nia went back to her lessons on Monday. She practiced every day without being asked. True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. The part that stays with me is not the video. It is not the 3 million views, or the Vienna Review, or the brass plate on the stool. It is the Vienna program. That folded, browned, tape-reinforced program. Program sitting on a dresser in an apartment in Harlan for 2 years, beside a violin case that had traveled from Mississippi to Europe and back, not on display, not framed on the wall, just there, on the dresser, kept. She did not need anyone else to know what it represented. She knew. That was enough for 70 years, and it would have gone on being enough. The world is full of that. Full of people who are carrying something extraordinary and have stopped waiting for the room to notice, who have made their peace with obscurity because the work was always the point, who press on not because recognition is coming, but because the work itself is worth the pressing. And here is the thing I want you to sit with. There is something you have put down, not lost, put down. Set on a shelf or in a case, or folded and taped at the crease and left on a dresser. Something you were once very serious about. Something that once felt like breathing and then felt at some point like a thing that required explanation. A violin, a canvas, a manuscript, a language you stopped practicing, a voice you stopped using. And somewhere along the way, without announcing it, without a ceremony or a decision you fully made, you started describing yourself as someone who used to do that thing. So here is my question, and I want the honest answer, not the comfortable one. What are you carrying? One word. Drop it in the comments below. If this story reached something in you, share it with one person tonight. Not as a recommendation, as a conversation. Because some people need to see what a room can hold. Subscribe if you are not subscribed. Every story on this channel is built on the same belief, that the most important things in a life are almost always invisible until they are not. We tell them slowly, and we tell them whole. Next time, we are going to the kitchen. A dishwasher at a restaurant in New Orleans has been quietly cooking his own food at the end of every shift for 11 years, tasting it alone, and throwing it away, until the night a Michelin inspector sat down at the wrong table. Come back for that one. True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching.